Hi everyone, I'm Jared Ball, Chief Economist for CEDA, the Committee for Economic Development of Australia. Welcome to today's live stream. Is Australia's big infrastructure spend delivering value? Today we'll be discussing how Australia can get better value out of its infrastructure spend. That is, how we can build better coordination to maximise our resources, minimise cost and time blowouts, and build our infrastructure sustainably. CEDA begins by acknowledging that today and every day we are on Aboriginal land. We're committed to recognition and reconciliation, we respect elders and we support their stated aspirations. And as we discuss infrastructure today, I think it's worth recognising Aboriginal people as the first infrastructure builders on this land, engineering the first aquaculture systems, houses, villages, and all manner of other beginning infrastructure. I'd like to thank and acknowledge our sponsors for today's live stream, Arup, IFM Investors and Partners in Performance. Conversations like this are simply not possible without the incredible support of our member organisations, and we thank you for that. Today, as at all CEDA events, you can interact with our fantastic panel through our Q&A portal, which is available via the link on your screen, or you can go to ceda.pigeonhole.at and put in the passcode BUILDINGAUS. You can post your questions, vote on others' questions, and participate in a poll question that we've got today. And that poll question is, which issue is most critical for ensuring we can deliver value on big infrastructure? As I always say, these things, get in early, get in often, and get your questions in. We will be asking as many of them as we can, so don't feel like your questions won't be seen or asked to our panel. You can also join the conversation on Twitter by using the hashtag today, which is hashtag BuildingAUS, and tagging in CEDA News at CEDA_news. In coming years, we're really going to be trying to do something we have never done before, scaling up to deliver a major public infrastructure investment pipeline north of $200 billion. And we're embarking on this at a time when the economy is in a bit of a state of COVID flux, driving things like skills shortages and supply chain issues. And at the same time, we've got momentum intensifying towards net zero and more sustainable infrastructure. So it's clear that a business as usual approach is not going to get the job done, and that government and industry will need to work together to drive much needed productivity and innovation in our infrastructure build. Luckily, I have a fantastic panel who are living and breathing these issues to talk through them today. We've got David Hallinan, who's the Deputy Secretary at the Department of Infrastructure, Transport, Regional Development and Communications. We've got Michael Huggins, who's the Head of Australia, New Zealand Partners in Performance. Romilly Madew, AO, who's the Chief Executive Officer of Infrastructure Australia. And Kate West, who's the Co-Chair of Arup. So reminder again, please jump on Pigeonhole, get your questions in, but I will get them rolling for you. And I want to come to you first, Romilly. This is obviously an area that Infrastructure Australia has done a lot of work and a lot of thinking and research on, whether it's in your regular Infrastructure Australia plan or some of the work that you've done on market capacity. When you think about this, what are some of the biggest kind of and most opportune levers that you think about in terms of how we really kind of maximise the value and efficiency in this big pipeline that we've got?
Thanks for that, Jared, and thanks for the opportunity for CEDA and others. I'm really looking forward to the discussion today. I just want to put in context, firstly, what we're dealing with here. So Infrastructure Australia recently released our market capacity report for this year, but it'll be something that we'll be doing regularly for the first secretaries. And this was requested by us from COAG early last year, and it was in response, I remember that was the start of COVID, and it was a response to the then record investment pipeline. So three major areas have really been identified in the market capacity work, and then I'm going to talk about the reforms. So a new wave of public infrastructure investment, we're all saying that, so it's a 100% growth rate compared to the current activity, and it's peaking at $52 billion in 2023. The second that we're seeing is unprecedented demand and constraints in supply. And so that's really taking on board what's been happening in the last 18 months with COVID as well. So we see demand for skills and materials will be 2/3 higher than the previous 5 years. A skill shortage of 105,000 unfulfilled jobs forecast for 2023, and demand for materials is projected to grow at 30% per annum between 2021 and 2023. And finally, increasing risks and interdependencies, market capacity constraints in the supply of skills and resources and associated risk for escalation and delivery present an additional and growing risk category. So I've identified the challenges that we're dealing with at the moment, but let's not reflect the pipeline's incredibly important, and it was very important as part of the stimulus in response to COVID. So what are the key reforms that we've identified coming out and that we've included in the 2021 Australian Infrastructure Plan? The main one is, and we were talking before as a panel behind, BAU is no longer where we need to be. We need a step change in productivity, and this needs to unlock by governments transitioning towards production and manufacturing approaches for the sector and starting with adopting portfolio management. We also need to look at active portfolio and pipeline management, and that's really at a state level. You've got to remember the federal government, the federal government, grant money, but it's the states and territories who deliver improved front-end engineering and design. I'm in Canberra today, so I'm going to blame this on Spring. Increased collaboration with industry, and we've seen that really come to the forefront through COVID, embedding digital practices and increased public sector capacity and capability. So I'll leave it at there, Jared.
Thank you, Romilly, and thanks for working through Canberra in the springtime and the effect that it can have on one's voice. And perhaps while we're in Canberra, we can come to you, David, and Romilly's made a really important point about the different roles of the federal government and state governments in terms of portfolio management and delivery. How do you see the role of the federal government and the steps that it can take in this area and trying to drive greater productivity and innovation through the infrastructure spend?
Thanks, Jared. Look, the first point I'd make is we've actually got record pollen counts in the history of Canberra right now. So Rom's got a very good point. But no, we welcome all the advice that comes from Infrastructure Australia, and we recognise the challenge that exists over the next 5 to 10 years. The Commonwealth can play, I think, quite an important role in facilitating and coordinating actions with states and territories, but we need to do that in full recognition of the nature of our federation. And that states are democracies of their own, and they set their own priorities. So we do very much have a facilitating role to play, and we're leading into, I think, a renegotiation of the national partnership agreements for infrastructure over the next couple of years. In my time being in the portfolio, so I started here on the first day of the national lockdown of the pandemic. I have to say I've been very impressed and very pleased with the level of engagement at officials levels between the Commonwealth and the states, and exactly how much we work together to deliver on the challenges that we face. A good example of that would be the stimulus activities. We worked very closely with jurisdictions on a priority setting, which was about making sure that we had as many jobs in the system as we could distributed across the country. We're moving out of that phase now as the pandemic restrictions start to be removed, and we'll be moving into a phase, I think, which is about delivering on the mega projects that are in the system and making sure that those are built in a way that's coordinated as well as we can to get allocative efficiency in the system. And those projects are really important. We're not going to not continue them. They're very important for us to deliver on productivity reforms for the future. Right now is the time to do it from our perspective, and we do have very much a facilitating role to play across the board with the Commonwealth and the states.
Well, thanks, David. So we've had Romilly talk about some of the important points that have come out of the IA research on this and some of the clear challenges that we've got on the demand and the supply side. David, you've given us a little bit of optimism there, I think, around how officials are working together at the government level. I want to come to you, Michael, and talk about the private sector and just the level of capacity that you think is presently there in the private sector, and I guess the appetite as well around doing things differently and achieving a step change in productivity, as Romilly puts it.
Thanks, Jared. Yeah, it's a good point. Capacity is an important question. It's very exciting. The idea we've got a pipeline that's going to double the amount that we spend in infrastructure is a great opportunity. It's great for the economy. It's great for jobs. But by the same token, trying to double capacity in our construction ecosystem is a big deal. And we know we've seen this story before. We saw it in the mining construction boom. We saw it in the gas construction boom. And when we get this rapid increase in spend, we do run into challenges around cost blowouts and schedule blowouts. And major projects in Australia, we're seeing recently 35% increase in overspend, 15% in schedule. So it is a challenge, and it is something we need to work on. But there are things that we can do. I think the industry is working on it. But there is more to do. For instance, just in terms of sequencing and planning these projects as they're coming through the pipeline is a great opportunity. 2 out of 5 projects are happening within 5 kilometres of each other. And that is just putting immense stresses on local labour pools and suppliers. And, more can be done. And we need to think about the agencies, the delivery agencies, the scheduling, and smoothing the peaks so that we can, successfully get through this infrastructure pipeline. But secondly, also just thinking there's things happening around de-risking projects at the start of construction. We know we've had challenges in transport projects on utility diversions and also soil and spoil disposal strategies. They're things that we need to invest in up front and get right. We also need to work on permitting and approval processes. One of the things that we saw as being quite successful in the mining and gas construction boom was actually investing more in management tools and processes and reporting in the construction businesses to make the project progress more transparent. We can't overnight increase the number of 20-year veterans that are construction managers. You just can't double that experience overnight. But we can put in place management processes, tools to help the newer generation coming through manage the projects and manage them successfully. Yeah.
Thanks, Michael. And Kate, I guess a lot of these things also come down to culture within workforces and within the private sector in construction. How do you see the kind of culture evolving, particularly at a time when we do have this massive pipeline and there is more work coming? Is this something that we can do in parallel to this work?
Thanks, Jared. No, I think it's a great question, and certainly I think we've got this once in a generation opportunity that we're leaning into at the moment with the quantum of spend that you've articulated, but these whole range of sort of opportunities and challenges at play, coupled climate change, with the COVID crisis that we're seeing, digital transformation. So I think the sort of whole suite of factors that we're facing into and the opportunity to use this infrastructure spend to really lay the foundation of not just our economy, but our society for the next, decades to come, I think is fantastic. I think, what I really like about the infrastructure plan, Romilly, that you and your team have pulled together is this underlying call out for co-creation and collaboration. So across industry and government, across the states, the federal level of government, the need for us to all come together to work collaboratively to really unlock these opportunities. None of us alone, Arup alone, state government alone can't do this. I think it is this culture of coming together. And I think we're seeing good examples of that. I've got the privilege of working with Major Roads Program Victoria at the moment on a really good partnership. And what we're seeing by that collaboration, by that coming together, is we're unlocking social procurement. We're bringing in groups like the Brotherhood of St Lawrence to really start to address some of these opportunities of diversifying our skills pools and making sure that we can meet the demand of infrastructure. So I think we're seeing some good signs. I think there is more that we can do. And I think we're just talking before about the sort of federation of states and the challenges of our states moving at different paces. and potentially in different directions. So I think actually that culture of collaboration of industry and government coming together is something we should double down on to really capitalise on some of the opportunities. Take transport, for instance, low emissions vehicles. Certainly there's an enormous amount we can do together to make sure we get those policy settings and investment working hand in hand.
Thanks for that, Kate. And I will remind everyone again that the Q&A portal is definitely open. Pigeonhole, ceda.pigeonhole.at. That's appearing on the screen as I speak. I have full license to go straight to those questions and can get the panel to answer them. So please put your questions in. Everyone, I think, pretty much in those comments has mentioned the issues around skills. And I think Michael, you used the point around, we can't overnight double the number of people with 20 years of experience. And Romilly, you've talked about the 105,000 people that we'll need. Interested, Romilly, in terms of it's clear that there's no silver bullet here in terms of the skills challenge in this sector. What are the sort of policy and industry levers that you think that we need to pull in terms of building up the skills that we need and the raw numbers of workers to in what is a really great opportunity, I think, for our labour market as well?
Thanks. Yeah, look, you're right. It isn't a silver bullet. There are a number of opportunities, and I will talk about what many people have commented on, and they've said, migration. Migration is just part of it. It really is. There's productivity, innovation we need to see, and change we need to see across our sector. I think before you mentioned culture, one of the things we need to look at is we have the lowest participation rate of females in construction in Australia against any other sector. So there's a lot of women in Australia that we could attract into our sector. But then we really need to look at culture. And one of the comments we've also talked about today is the importance of collaboration. And a live example of a wonderful collaboration is between New South Wales Victorian Government and ACA called SILF, Construction in Leadership Forum, and they've actually created a culture task force and put out a culture standard. And they're the types of collaborations we want to see. And so by putting that standard in place and looking at changing the culture in our sector, we should be able to attract women into our sector. In the work that we've done, we've also found adjacency. There are people with skills in other sectors that we can attract into our sector. The issue we have is we are competing with the other sectors. Public infrastructure is only 20% of the whole infrastructure package, but we can attract people into our sectors. And another form of collaboration is the I-bodies are working, the states and territories with the federal government are working really closely together to understand what the opportunities are and where we can ensure that we can increase the skills and increase the capability and capacity to deliver this pipeline. And the final one is, let's not forget the importance of our universities and tertiary sector like TAFE, and let's not forget our professional bodies like the Engineers Australia, Planning Institute of Australia, and our other professional bodies. There are real opportunities here to collaborate together to attract and get our young students who are studying now to get on-site learning now. Let's go back to the days of on-site learning, and we can have that and get them to upskill faster than is normally the case. And I know there are a lot of conversations happening across that field, but we do need to ensure that there is collaboration across the professional bodies and academia to make sure that we've got the courses, we're attracting the students into those courses, and we're getting them on site very quickly. We are losing project management skills, signalling, tunnelling. We're losing those skills because of the ageing and maturing nature of the people who have those skills in the market. We need to attract more people into that area. I gave a presentation the other day, and the response from one of our board members is, I'm definitely going to suggest to any young person I talk to, get a trade. So that's where the opportunities are. Get a trade.
Thanks, Romilly. I like that final bit of advice as an economist who did consider taking on a trade. I sometimes have regrets about that. I just want to continue on a little bit of some of Romilly's themes there, and in particular, there's a question that's come in on Pigeonhole for you, Kate, in terms of Romilly's point around increasing workforce participation of women in the sector. And I think it obviously goes directly to the point around culture as well, and the extent to which that can address some of these skill shortages. And I guess anything else you think that would complement that in terms of addressing skill shortages.
No, I think it's it's a great point, Romilly, about women. I think we're certainly seeing statistics that construction and infrastructure really aren't capitalising on 50% of our population. We look at women in construction, 13% of women, I think IA have quoted, are in STEM careers. We look at construction CEOs, 3% of construction CEOs are women. So we are really missing a huge pool of our population. So I think there is no silver bullet to this skills shortage. Demand is quoted as being 48% higher than supply of skills at its peak. So I think we do need to look at a whole range of measures about, aged workers, retraining people, having them migrate across. But I think women is a particular area that we must focus on in infrastructure. I think it does come down to culture. Certainly at Arup, we've been looking at a whole range of measures. We're going for a target of 40-40-20, 40% women, 40% men, 20% either. And things like flexible working arrangements, the future of work, I think, is critical to get right here, parental leave policies, but actually the culture that we enable through our infrastructure sector. We employ over 1 million people in construction, from labourers to engineers to lawyers. And I think actually we've got to look at the settings that women are working in across all of those services and skills areas. So I was actually at the NAWIC Awards last week, National Association of Women in Construction Awards, and actually there were some fantastic stories coming through. The Apprentice of the Year was a lady who had just left retail recently, years of experience in retail, and suddenly realised actually there was this wonderful opportunity to take up a trade. So she's now having this fulfilling career, wonderful time, but still some barriers to her entry to site, and the culture around, the site environment. But the outcomes have been really positive. So I think certainly, collectively as an industry, we should be doing more to get those settings right to enable women's participation to increase. And I think, 2021, there is no time to sort of pause on this. The time for action is now.
Thank you, Kate. And we are getting some questions coming through into Pigeonhole, I'm glad to report, and I would encourage you to keep putting your questions in. I do have one that I'm going to come to David and Michael on, and it's from Philip Davies at Deloitte, who's asking about the views on the opportunities to have a greater focus on more deliberate and coordinated population or settlement planning combined with greater systems thinking in planning and delivery. And I might come to you first, Michael, because you raised this point around the number of projects that we have that are going on within 5 kilometres of each other, and a lot of that does have to do with the nature of our cities. Do you see opportunities here that we should be taking, perhaps at a government level, around more strategic planning of settlement?
Yeah, absolutely. And even just the phasing of it, I think, is important. So it's not just a matter of we can't do projects within 5 kilometres of each other. It's more around when do we do it, and thinking through, the stresses that's going to put on, delivering it. I think as we look at the pipeline of projects as they're coming in at the moment, a lot of that is being delivered by the large construction firms. And if we can reparcel some of that work into smaller packages, then we're, leaning into a different part of the market and, reaching into different organisations and providing extra capacity that way. I also think, we need to also just think about demand for that activity, whether it's productivity, whether it's automation, but there's a lot of opportunities for us to increase the productivity of the workforce that we have.
And David, this is an area that historically, certainly, your department has sort of looked at. Is this a focus at all at the moment in terms of officials' discussions around future population? Obviously, some ongoing uncertainties in terms of population projections and what happens as migration comes back. But obviously, it's an interesting point around how we put these two kind of planning mechanisms together in terms of how we sequence our infrastructure projects.
Yeah, certainly. Look, I think that's something that we do need to consider over time. I'd just make the observation that through the COVID period, there's been internal migration patterns that we didn't predict, and people have moved from some of the major cities. They're moving to satellite cities around the country, to regional centres as well. There's been a substantial population shift that you can track. The key, I think, on this is, to some extent, governments can work on how do you plan for the right population in the right zones, but to do so in isolation of the agency of individuals who will come to Australia and settle for their own various purposes is hard. We'll pick up one side of the story, but we won't pick up both sides of the story through that simple government planning arrangements. The migration diaspora and their movements of people as they settle into the country is, I think, probably a little bit unpredictable, and we will need to understand and watch what happens as migration patterns return. What will be our migration diaspora? Who will be coming to Australia in a pre-COVID and post-COVID sense? Will it be the same thing? So I think there's a fair bit of uncertainty there, but it's something that we're definitely watching. We're also talking about, and the way I would describe it currently is we've paid particular attention to what have been the patterns of population movements through the COVID period. And we really do need to give some thought to what's going to happen post-COVID. We will return to migration. We're a migration nation. 30% of us were born overseas. 50% of us have a parent born overseas. So I think that's a lived reality for this country. And how best we can plan for what that return might look like, and how we can settle a good infrastructure pipeline to make sure everyone's lives are very livable when they do get here.
Thanks, David. We do have some more questions coming in, but again, I urge you to jump on the portal and ask them. We do have a question here from BJL, which I will direct to you in the first instance, Romilly, just asking about what seems to be the bottleneck in current mega projects from a macro kind of view, and asking about, is it drivers around contracting process or poor delivery capability, or perhaps some of the capacity issues that we've been talking about today. Do you have a view on that?
Thanks. Very complex question, and it really is dependent on the different mega projects. So each mega project is dealing with its own challenges. Supply chain is definitely a challenge. So that's both supply chain constraints within Australia and also dealing with global supply chain markets as well. Other ones as well, coming back to supply chain, is both not just supply chain for materials, plant and equipment, but also supply chains for staff and expertise. So again, that supply chains within Australia and outside of Australia. So it depends on the stage of where the mega project's at. So for instance, some mega projects may need a tunnel boring machine, TBM, and they may be in one of our states that the borders are currently shut. And so it really does depend on where that mega project is. Other ones are to do with the utilities and doing that front end planning, and then having to experience things that were unknown as you were planning the project. And we all know that can happen on mega projects or any project. Challenges identify during construction, and we know that there's a number of mega projects that have struggled with that as well. Materials is definitely an issue, and so what we're looking at IA and what we pick up in the Australian Infrastructure Plan is looking at reform and look at the big picture and really look at each element of it. Risk allocation, contracting, government being a mature client, collaboration between government and industry, looking at front-end planning and engineering, because each of our projects, as I said, struggles with different challenges, but we need those mega projects. As Dave Hallinan says, our migration will pick up and we need to make sure that those projects can be on time and on budget. But what we're dealing with in Australia is being dealt with all over the world. So when you look at mega projects, they will have those challenges. They are big projects. They're complex projects and they take time. And we are seeing inflationary pressures. They're all experiencing them, but they're all experiencing them over the world as well. So I think you've just got to put it into context as what's happening at the moment. If we were having this conversation pre-COVID, we probably would have been talking about other challenges, but we're not. We're in the middle of COVID. And a point that Dave also made is it's uncertain. So, problems are popping up. And I just want to raise another issue. Data, and I'm hoping that someone asks questions about data. People were talking about the opportunities of regional migration and so on and so forth. Data is our friend. Data has to be considered on every single project. How we capture the data, what are we tracking, how are we sharing it, what are we reporting on? If there's one thing that's come out of COVID, and if you look at the mega projects as well, understanding the data, sharing the data, standardisation of data is a real area that we need to focus on.
Thanks, Romilly. And I think a really interesting point there around mega projects and just the fact that there will inevitably be challenges and a number of countries are facing those challenges. Michael, I want to kind of ask a follow-up question on that to you. Do you think that we learn and absorb, or the industry learns and absorbs the lessons from past mega projects? Or is it a case that we are evolving so quickly and projects are by their nature becoming more and more complex that there's not necessarily specific lessons that you can take from one project to the next?
Yeah, good question. Definitely feel like we've got a sophisticated construction sector, one that has evolved and learned over time, one that, versus international, peers, performs very well on productivity. However, as we look into the pipeline that's about to happen, there is, serious concerns. I also do worry that we're not as digitally enabled, not as automated as some of the other sectors. We just haven't learned as quickly as some of those, whether it's the mining sector or the general economy. The productivity in the construction sector has not kept pace. It's behind the general economy. It's behind manufacturing. And I do think there's a lot of lessons to learn. There's things happening that are great, but we can do more of it. Like we take automation, just simple things like RFID tags to track equipment and materials coming onto a site and going off a site. That is something that's happening in pockets, but we can do more of it. Our estimate is that something like 40 to 50% of the tasks on a construction site today can be automated. I'm not talking about people, but rather tasks. And we can learn from that and we can roll it out faster. And I think there is an opportunity in doing that. We can also do it with payments, with there's use of drones, there's AI. So I think there's a lot for us to learn and a lot for us to build on. And although we're quite a sophisticated sector, there is much more to do, and we can look around at other sectors in the economy and see that, we have catch up to do.
Thanks, Michael. And we've got another question here, and I think it goes to the broader issue that we outlined at the start around doing all of this sustainably. And I want to come to you, Kate, on this. Someone's asked whether some of the supply chain pressures that we're seeing can sort of promote out of the box or creative thinking around circular economy and doing things more sustainably, and will this ultimately accelerate innovation? Kate, what do you think about that? I mean, on the one hand, there's a lot of pressure and a lot of pressure to deliver that doesn't always promote innovation, but at the same time, when you've got shortages of critical inputs, it can promote some of this innovation. And clearly, if we're going to get to the kind of net zero targets that we're now really moving towards, we're going to have to think differently. Do you see this happening, and do you think there's greater opportunity for us to really grasp this?
Oh, thanks, Jared, and great question from the audience. I think it's there's this moment in time. I think where actually the conversation has shifted, and we were talking about the other day with Romilly and others that 4 years ago, 5 years ago, this race to net zero wasn't on anyone's mind. We were talking about decarbonisation. The idea of getting to net zero at pace was not there. So I think the dialogue has shifted, and certainly the opportunity for what we can do as an industry across infrastructure is very real. So I think what we're seeing is very much an opportunity to double down on circular economy, on reducing greenhouse gas emissions through the construction industry and infrastructure. And certainly we are one of the big contributors. I was looking at the Clean Energy Finance Corporation figures. 70% of Australia's annual greenhouse gas emissions are attributed directly and indirectly to infrastructure. So we've got some really big issues to grapple with. And I think for us as an industry, it really starts at the early planning stage. So when we're looking at whether it's a build or a non-build solution, there's real opportunities there. And I think we're seeing some good shift of thinking, particularly in the non-build space. Been involved in a few major roads projects in Western Australia recently, where we've actually looked at smart freeways. Instead of building more, we've looked at the asset management and operation strategy to get better utilisation of our existing assets rather than actually bringing more infrastructure online. So I think there's some real opportunities at the front end. I think in terms of the reuse of assets, circular economy, I think there is more that we can be doing. And I think certainly as we start to head into this next chapter of really trying to quantify our greenhouse gas emissions, we're doing well in the building sector, translating that into infrastructure. I think we are looking to see what more we can do to really increase the reuse and adaptation of our infrastructure.
David, I want to continue this sort of theme with you in terms of, the kind of Commonwealth state coordination and the conversations that officials are having. Is this something that you think that is prominent in officials' minds as they're planning their infrastructure pipelines?
Yeah, it's certainly something that officials are looking at. I would just give you a couple of examples. We're investigating what sorts of materials can be recycled into roads. So how can you create a road building or construction sector that's reusing as much as possible? And I certainly know across multiple jurisdictions there are really good examples. And at this stage, they're examples. It's not systemic, but there are really good examples of reuse and recycle policies. A good one that I'll raise here is with Western Sydney Airport. They've been fortunate enough to be able to reuse a lot of the sandstone that was dug out through WestConnex, NorthConnex, the actual tunnelling projects in Sydney. That'll be reused on the Western Sydney Airport site on a very large scale. It's certainly something that project managers are thinking about. It's certainly something that officials are thinking about, and it's part and parcel of what we'll be doing as we move forward.
Thanks, David. And I might, Romilly, I know that IA, you've certainly hit this theme in a lot of the work that you've done as well. How do we think about this long term and sort of the decisions and the choices and the considerations that we have to make now to sort of make sure that infrastructure is making its contribution to this bigger goal?
Yeah, so we have updated our assessment framework this year, and the importance of the assessment framework is it is what states and territories and proponents use both to be considered for our infrastructure priority list, the pipeline, or for when we evaluate projects looking for over $250 million from the federal government. So what's in the assessment framework then we hope will drive good behaviour and change and good decision making. And when we were doing the update, we worked really closely with the states and territories. We actually had a cross-jurisdictional working group. And we realised, infrastructure is quite complex and it takes time to plan. So within the updated assessment framework, we talk about the importance of sustainability, incorporating it into the planning phase, and not only sustainability, but resilience as well, which I'll come back to. And so the three key areas we look at is strategic fit, societal impact. So that's where we're looking at sustainability, resilience, and inclusive design. How are we taking on board our engagement with our First Nations people? And then the final one is deliverability. In our assessment framework, we for the first time, we comment about the importance of using tools such as the Infrastructure Sustainability Council tool or the Green Building Council of Australia tool and incorporating that. And then the other piece of work we did was with Infrastructure New South Wales called Pathway to Infrastructure Resilience. And again, it comes back to upfront, incorporating it into the planning and design phase. And we've really got to change the behaviour in infrastructure. Some work and research that we did last year found what Dave said is it's not systemic, it's fragmented, and it's really been driven by either a project manager, a director general, or either a minister. But what we need to see is it needs to be embedded in these projects. If we have this high investment that we're seeing in infrastructure, and all the states and territories and the federal government have committed to net zero by 2050, we need to be seeing that sustainability and resilience elements embedded right up front. And there are wonderful examples, and we've talked about one. Dave talked about Western Sydney Airport. I know Transport for New South Wales has been very proactive in this space in looking at electrification of public transport, for instance. Don't reinvent the wheel. Look at others around. All those consultants on the line, you've got the skills, you've possibly done it in the built environment, which is more advanced than infrastructure at this stage when it comes to incorporating sustainability and resilience. We have the skills, knowledge and best practice here in Australia, but what we've got to see is that huge step change in infrastructure, and it has to start sooner rather than later. Remembering infrastructure is a long-term asset, 70 to 100 years, if not more. We really need to be seeing that embedded right up front.
Thanks, Romilly. And we do have another question, which I'm going to direct to you, Michael, that's come in, just asking where some of the kind of price and cost inflation and pressures are most pronounced at the moment. In the infrastructure pipeline?
Yeah, good question. Look, the greatest demand is going to be for finishing trades and labour. We've got a 140% increase in areas like that. Civil trades and labour as well, 130% increase. So, if we're taking a targeted view on areas to expand capacity, it's, as was said earlier, encourage more people to take a trade. Yeah, and I do also think these are areas where our focus on automation and digital can also help to get greater productivity. Yeah. Okay,
thanks, Michael. We do have a question from Jared Coburn in the Q&A around: is there a concern long infrastructure projects are being influenced by short-term politics? I might sort of expand that out and ask it in a slightly different way. Obviously, with 2022, with potential of three different elections, federal, South Australian, and Victorian, if my memory serves me correctly, and these obviously do lead to shorter term announcements. But as we've been talking about, we've got this big long term challenge, and I guess my question to each of the panel really is what you'd like to see in 2022 in terms of, the focus. Is it really around just dedicated, deliberate kind of delivery of the pipeline that we've got, and not kind of straying too far from that? And I might start with you, Kate. What are your sort of priorities in the next year?
Oh, look, it's a broad question, Jared. I think we've obviously got an enormous delivery pipeline upon us. And I think, one of the good things we have seen, and particularly, again, calling out the work of Infrastructure Australia, is we've seen some really good smoothing of that pipeline. So I think that's allowing us to really then make sure that we're delivering well, that we're getting excellence in our solutions, that we're actually delivering that long-term value. Because as you say, the infrastructure we build today effectively forms the foundation of our economy and our society for the next 50, 100 years. So we must get it right. When we say we want to be net zero by 2050, this infrastructure must speak to that need. So I think in terms of what I want to see for the next year, I think it's really that very sort of, deep thought on the COP26 commitments that we've made now, and making sure that we're really doubling down on that long-term thinking around sustainable development. So making sure that we are bringing the thinking around, how we're designing, how we're planning, how we're delivering with that long-range view in sight. And I think, to the point of, are we seeing short-term thinking drive outcomes? I actually think we are getting better at taking the long-range view. The Infrastructure Australia long-range state strategies are helping that. And I think shareholders and investors are actually leading the way. So I, look at groups like IFM, and I actually think with the sort of, breadth of capital, the breadth of long-range planning, we're seeing some much better thinking into the medium and long term.
Thanks, Kate. David, obviously officials work will go on for federal state officials in the next year, despite a number of elections. Where do you think the focus is going to be for that group?
I think we'll be focusing on the whole lot. So implementation is always going to be a key focus for us. We'll be held to account on implementation and delivery. Beyond that, I think we need to cast a fairly wide net on identification of future projects. What are the best projects that we can identify, finance, agree across each jurisdiction? At a Commonwealth level, this is a large Commonwealth state relations piece where you're dealing with not just the infrastructure asset base that exists in a state, you're also dealing with the new projects that states will identify, as well as any projects the Commonwealth may identify. Romilly does fantastic work through Infrastructure Australia to give us a plan for what the next big ones are. But it's a piece with jurisdictions where you're dealing with vertical fiscal imbalances, horizontal fiscal equalisation. It's mixed up in our tax system. And then on top of that, for us, we'll be contemplating what are the ways that we can align our investments to exactly what Kate just mentioned, the private sector model. How can we leverage balance sheets of the Commonwealth or states? How do we make sure that we've got good partners that have taken the same considered approach to what a project is to guarantee as much as we can that it's the best one available to us? So both delivery and future identification, I think, will remain key focuses for us at an officials level.
Thanks, David. And I'm going to come to Romilly and Michael on that question as well. But just a kind of final reminder: if someone's got a burning question, please throw it into Pigeonhole. We are coming up on time soon. But if someone was to put a question in there, I'm sure I would be able to fit it in. Romilly, interestingly, Kate and David have both had great things to say about IA and the work that you're doing to put the long-term focus absolutely front and centre. How do you see the next year in terms of getting that kind of keeping that long-term focus there, as we do have as we always do, a number of electoral cycles and things going on, and who knows what kind of happens with COVID next year as well?
I think that's the great thing about the Australian Infrastructure Plan is that it's a 15-year view, and we throw that down into 5-year areas, so not to 5 years, 5 to 10, 10 to 15. But taking that 15-year view then goes through a number of electoral cycles, and that's the aim of the work that we do when you look at the audit and the plan, is that we're taking that long-term lens. And what we really want to see in the coming years is this continuation of reform in the sector, and that's what the plan is all about. To improve in productivity and innovation, we really do need to see reform. But I also want to call out what has happened with the I-bodies in the last 18 months. So we're the national I-body, Infrastructure Australia, and then all the states and territories have I-bodies. And they've either updated their state infrastructure strategy, their SIS, they've made sure that they've developed a new infrastructure strategy, but every single one in the last 18 months has looked at its SIS. And they're very much aligned with the work that we're doing at Infrastructure Australia. And it's picking up at a couple of key points. So the importance of a clear and investable pipeline, the importance of productivity and innovation improvements by the sector, the importance of resilience and sustainability. Another area that we haven't really touched on, well, two other areas we haven't really touched on today, but really incorporate together, is that place-based approach and recognising the uniqueness of Australia's geographies but also thinking about the importance of our region. So Dave Hallinan talked about this view of, we've seen this migration into the regions. There's opportunities for remote, rural and regional Australia, and we will continue working and looking at those opportunities. When we think about Northern Australia and we're thinking about industry, innovation and productivity, where do the critical minerals come from? Then we're thinking about that we need to use in our technologies. Where are the opportunities coming from around thinking about renewables? We think it's a really exciting time, and as we've all talked about, the collaboration between industry and government has never been as great as it is now. It is, we really are on the cusp of continuing to do some great work together, but we need to make sure that the reforms that have been identified in the Australian Infrastructure Plan, that we acknowledge them and continue to work collaboratively together to ensure that we work on actionable outcomes on each of the reforms.
Thanks, Romilly. And I think that theme of collaboration and some encouraging signs on that have been sort of a theme that's run through a lot of the discussion today. Michael, with that in mind, what do you think industry will be looking for in the next 12 months from government during an interesting electoral period?
Yeah, I think industry definitely has a role to play and have a lot to do. However, I think we also need to appreciate, the typical margins in construction sector of 3% means that we just can't rely on construction firms alone doing all the heavy lifting. And as Romilly mentioned, collaboration, I think on 3 levels. So, firstly, the construction industry thinking about, ethical sourcing, waste, construction projects. But then secondly, the project owners and the agencies, thinking about the right projects. Is it a road or should it be light rail? And some of those decisions actually impact more of the outcomes, not just financially, but also sustainability more so. And then finally, government having the right settings is very important. The right policies, in a competitive industry that needs to be set to ensure we move in the right direction.
Thank you, Michael. And we've had Tim May, who's an investment director of infrastructure at IFM Investors, who's patiently been on the line listening to this whole conversation. And I'd like to go to him now in terms of, some of the critical insights that you've taken out of it and kind of some of the implications and summing up, Tim.
Thanks, Jared. And as we've heard from Romilly, we're facing significant challenges and pressures in delivering record levels of infrastructure spend. These challenges of delivering value around infrastructure have never been greater. But what can we do as leaders across the infrastructure space to take proactive actions to deliver better value? I've noted 3 takeaways from this discussion: collaboration, inclusion, and sustainability. Regarding collaboration, David has provided some welcome insights around how government is working together more than ever, both at a federal level and state level, to deliver vital productivity reforms and also working with trusted partners. Around that theme, Michael and Kate spoke to a culture of co-creation between industry, contractors and investors. So working together at a much earlier stage to deliver this incredible pipeline. Some of the benefits of co-creation involve us being more efficient, being more well sequenced in how we manage projects, which might often be located close together, and mitigating key risks at a much earlier stage. IFM Investors has been fortunate to be able to partner with governments and our infrastructure assets across, I'll just mention 2 key projects during the pandemic. The first one was the Brisbane Cruise Terminal, and the second one, which I'm pleased to mention, was a school redevelopment project in the Illawarra that opened to students just last month. Both of these projects were developed in partnership with government and actually achieved good outcomes in terms of on budget, on time outcomes. So for all of us going forward, how will you seek to bring forward that collaboration, leverage those enhanced digital practices and drive greater productivity going forwards. So secondly, inclusion. So whilst we can't double the capacity of the market overnight, there are steps we can take as an industry to build up skills. And as Romilly mentioned, it's not just about migration, but also about increasing female participation in the workforce. So to drive this increased participation, cultural change remains vital. However, that comes down to all of us. So as a second takeaway, what steps can you take to promote a more inclusive culture? And just another point on inclusion, this can also be viewed from the perspective of taking projects out to market. So in the past, we've looked to deliver these huge projects, and now we're seeing this comes with significant risks when issues emerge with some of the mega projects. But there are opportunities to unlock the capacity of the tremendous Australian mid-tier construction firm market. So perhaps if you're involved in that, what actions can you take to greater unlock some of that mid-tier construction firm capacity in the market? And third, sustainability. So Kate and Romilly talked about thinking differently about the long term. The conversation shifted around decarbonisation, and we now have that opportunity to double down on our efforts to minimise whole-of-life emissions across the infrastructure sector. And we've heard the greatest opportunities start at the planning phase of these projects. So as part of our work, we're looking both in terms of how we're delivering projects, but for us as an infrastructure manager in particular, around the ongoing operations to bring forward some of the net zero commitments we're making and bring forward change as much as possible. But really for those involved at the front end of the planning process and delivering these projects, really urge you to think about how we can reduce the whole of life emissions profile. And there's probably going to be more challenges and greater developments in that sector to come. So as a body, let's not lose sight of the challenge ahead, but also take advantage of the opportunity to leverage everything we've learnt from COVID to drive those three key takeaways. So collaboration, inclusion, and sustainable practices. Jared, back over to you.
Well, thank you for that, Tim. And I think your sort of three things were embedded, but also reflected in the poll that we had today. And that poll was, which issue is most critical for ensuring we can deliver on big infrastructure, deliver value on big infrastructure, I should say. And the number one vote getter with around 43% was better coordination of the infrastructure pipeline at the state and federal level with clear project sequencing across jurisdictions. Coming in second at around 29% was bridging the skills gap, managing supply and demand, education and skills sharing, which we've just heard about. And equal to that was building sustainably. So I think encouraging to see that was certainly at least equal with the skills shortages focus. Not a lot of concern around supply chain disruption, which in the last few days we've seen shipping costs come down, and many of us are hopeful that some of those markets are starting to normalise and will moderate. So that may be a good sign. I absolutely want to thank our speakers, our panel today, who have been fantastic. David Hallinan, Michael Huggins, Romilly, Madew, and Kate West. As always, thank you for your participation and taking so many questions. I would also like to thank our sponsors. As I said, we can't do this without them. Arup, IFM investors and partners in performance, your support is greatly appreciated. You can still rate your experience in Pigeonhole, so please don't jump off Pigeonhole just yet. And in terms of upcoming discussions that CEDA is having, and certainly this infrastructure series will continue through roundtables and a conference and so forth. So absolutely, please keep your eye on the CEDA website, ceda.com.au, and we will have further details of this series coming up, a very important conversation for Australia over the coming years. With that, I would like to leave you right on time, very punctual, finishing on time as CEDA events always do. And please go well and enjoy the rest of your day and week. Thank you very much.